for joining us to the 63rd of the invited series of Register Talks, where we invite leading thinkers from around Europe and the world to come and share their experiences and their insights to this kind of incredible discipline we're all involved in. Today we're going to be joined by Professor Kate Goodwin, live from Sydney, hence our unusually early start. But I actually prefer these morning lectures, I have to say, Kate, to the evening ones, mainly because of young kids interrupting me. And just a reminder to those gathering that the next lecture will be on Wednesday, April the 7th. It will be Toshiko Mori joining us from the US. And after that, it will be on May the 5th, which will be Professor Thomas Bo Jensen joining us to talk about Per Kirkeby's architecture, the artist Per Kirkeby's architecture. But to this morning, we're joined by the curator and critic and educator, Professor Kate Goodwin, who is has been now for a number of years the curator of architecture at the Royal Academy in London, and is now professor of practice in it's Sydney University, isn't it, Kate?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so at the moment she's juggling these two roles. And this is a really nice moment, I think, to catch Kate as she looks back on her career in the Royal Academy, where she really expanded the ambition and scope of what architectural curation might look like and what an architectural exhibition might feel like, making incredible exhibitions both about architects and about their process, but also through architecture and via the experience of space directly. And I think Kate's going to talk about both those polarities, or maybe they're not even polarities, this evening. Because as we know, architecture is it must be a frustrating topic for a curator. I mean, it produces an awful lot in its process about how it comes into the world, but it's very difficult to connect people with the experiential conditions of architecture as such. And so it differs slightly from other forms of curatorial practice, although there are huge overlaps, obviously, in terms of installation work and that kind of stuff that does have massive architectural overlaps. Anyway, so without me blathering on too much longer, I'm going to pass on to Kate. And I know we're joined by students of curation here at the Kingston School of Art, and others. I can see Laura Marks here and others who are in the same disciplinary field as Kate. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion at the end. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Kate, and you can take it from there. Thank you so much.
God, sorry, I can't find where my share screen is.
Top right.
It's just hiding behind my oh no, I don't want that. Sorry. Oh, I do. Sorry, was that giving you the
that turned off your camera?
Sorry, what about this one? Does that turn off my camera?
That turned off your camera.
Oh, well, that's nice. Do you want to see me?
I think it's well, it's up to you, Kate. We appear as tiny boxes down the bottom of people's screens, but it's up to you. I think maybe it's nice for the audience to see you.
I just don't know how to do that.
No, you unfortunately, the speaker's experience in Teams is amazingly blank. Everybody disappears, and you're just talking to your PowerPoint, Kate.
But how do I turn my? How do you make me see? How can you see me?
We can all see you down the bottom of our screens.
Oh, you can.
Kate.
Oh, good.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, you've got to look at me. The really lovely thing is I don't have to look at myself, which is one of those awful things of team of this world at the moment we're in. Anyway, Andrew, thank you very much. I don't actually think I've been called professor that many times, ever. It was a role of professor of practice that came in that I started actually at the beginning of last year, and not necessarily the reason I'm out here. I sort of found myself out here for other reasons and been able to stay on. But as Andrew said, it is a kind of really interesting junction for me. I've been as head of architecture and host curator at the Royal Academy for the past 17 and a half years, and I've just decided to step down from that role, and I'm handing it to Vicky Richardson in about 2 weeks' time. And so I guess it's in that process, it's quite interesting to think about, I guess, what's been done in that time, and shifts in curatorial practice, and also shifts, I think, within institutions, particularly the Royal Academy, and to try and make sense of the kind of field in which it operates, which I think especially came into focus when I was made this professor of practice. And I guess it's kind of this argument as to, I would view sort of curating as a sort of form of architectural practice in some ways. And while I'd say that building is, it's absolutely central to architecture, but it's also informed and shaped by things beyond building. And I think when one starts to think about it, particularly as an art form, as sort of as something that exists in the realm of ideas, and that it kind of participates in a sort of critical and creative discourse. And so I've been really interested in thinking about the sphere of, I guess, where some of those aspirations and ambitions can be developed outside of or before building. But I do see it as a sort of quite often bringing in this sense of a spatial practice. And that's possibly because I trained as an architect and have that way of looking at the world, but also I think also almost in thinking about design thinking and processes seems to sort of pull it. And I guess another thing that I would say is often I see the role we play, or particularly where I've been operating, is in this kind of connector and a bridge between the profession and the public. And that's also in the kind of role of what I'm seeing, what I'm doing here in Sydney is this role as professor of practice. I mean, I've gone super introducing curating, just as a term, and sorry for those in the curating course here, probably Jana's going to shoot me, but I guess I just wanted to sort of introduce it to an architectural audience as well. But I think we traditionally sort of think about the curator as a sort of keeper of cultural heritage in an institution, something like a gallery, museum, library, archive, and someone who's a content specialist charged with the institution's collection and involvement with its interpretation. And so some of those basic principles really are custodians of objects and knowledge, and being charged with its care, and interpreting and sharing and disseminating that. And that's sort of where it has sat, very much traditionally in how we think about it. But the culture of, in a piece of writing called The Culture of Curating, Paul O'Neill cites 1987 as a really turning point for the role. And there was two things that were underpinned that. Le Magasin, which is an art centre in France, which introduced Europe's first postgraduate curatorial training program. And the same year, Whitney renamed its program from the Art History Museum Studies pathway to Curatorial and Critical Studies. And since then, the kind of, it's, sorry, it's supposed to be on this slide, he underlines the fact that actually it took curatorship from what was a vocational work with collections and institutions to potentially independent, quickly engaged, experimental form of exhibition making process. And with that has also come a real expansion of the definition of a curator, and to somebody that selects, organises and presents online all sorts of content, but also still using this kind of professional expert knowledge. And I mean, I think, as we all know, and the cartoon captures quite nicely on the left, is that it has become a somewhat ubiquitous term, sort of applied to all manner of things, and everyone is a curator of some form. I think it's quite interesting to see this is the mentions of the word curator over time. And actually, I couldn't get the graph off where 2020 is, but it's kind of, that curve continues up very steeply. And I, came in at sort of about 2003 into this role. But I mean, for me, it's always been really important to the sort of role of thinking about architecture in a sort of cultural sphere and not part of a construction industry, something that sits outside of market and within a sort of sphere of realm of ideas, I guess, going back to what I was saying before. And I have always felt very passionately about how important it is to have an informed public and cultural discourse on architecture, and that's been the focus of what I've been doing and what I hope to do into the future as well. And it sits within a tradition, I guess, across academies across Europe, which started with things like the Royal Academy of Architecture, which was founded in 1671 by King Louis of France, and that was about having. It was housed in the Louvre. It had a school, the student, so that relationship between sort of for students and the public, and that then dissolved, became the Academy of Beaux-Arts, and then there's other academies were spurned after that, Danish Academy, Royal Academy, and all others. Then there's the what's interesting, there was the first curatorial department devoted to architecture and design was established in 1932 at MoMA, which was only 3 years after MoMA itself was established. So it was quite quickly after its inception. It was very much, the collection was built on the recognition that architecture and design are allied in independent arts. And so that's when they started collecting formally. At a slightly different level, the Venice Architecture Biennale, which was founded in 1890, Venice Art Biennale was founded in 1895, but architecture didn't come in as an independent entity until relatively recently in sort of 1980. So I think I found it quite interesting reflecting actually about where architecture is sat in and outside of some of these sort of wider cultural spheres. And I think the kind of context in which one presents architecture is always relevant to how it's received, how you put on, what the audience is. And I was just kind of thinking around, that those places that are very specifically, like the CCA, which has a very deep research embedded, and it's furthering, I guess, the discipline for the profession as well as for a public, where other places are much more publicly focused, and it's actually bringing the public along with what is happening within the profession, and that they operate in different places. Some places are very site-specific, like New London Architecture, which is dealing with the development happening in London, which is akin to what's happening at the Danish Architecture Museum. A lot of their work is focused on that area. And so I think that I sort of have a collection of all of these ones. I don't know whether you can recognise them all, but those contexts always start to play into, I think, how work's received and what sort of curatorial practice might be best fitted to those places. But this is the context I've been working since 2003, and it's, as I said, it's sort of a moment to reflect upon this. And I think institutions are strange beasts. I've watched this one over many years go through many different iterations, powers, different pushes and pulls in it, and that is always at the background, I think, to what we do. And they do come, I think, with sort of weight of history and a certain baggage and structure and governance. And the Academy is particularly interesting in this. It was founded in 1768 by a group of artists and architects, and under King George V, they received a special royal charter. And it was established to promote the arts of design in Britain through education and exhibition. And so it always had artists and architects as founding members in that, and they remain present. So architecture has been thus within the annual exhibition, which is part of what we were founded for. It was within the schools until the 1960s, and part of the Academy traditions. But more recently, the Academy has moved from just having the one annual summer exhibition to then had winter exhibitions, and now it's got a much more complex program of we're up to sort of 9 exhibitions a year across the site at different scales. And I think what's really amazing about them is also that we've got these 3 very different gallery spaces from different generations, and the sort of exhibitions that are hosted in these galleries comes from a real range, from sort of Renaissance to contemporary to the sorry, I'm losing words, but a real span to the things like Oceania. But I think we've often discussed, what is it that defines, with such a broad program of what defines exhibitions at the RA, and I think very often there's a certain intellectual rigour, there's often attention put into the staging of the shows, and understanding that the experience for the visitor is really important in that as to how they comprehend and take on information. And the RA was really an interesting leader in the blockbuster exhibition and of foregrounds itself, and that's also what a lot of the finances and box office is sort of driven around for the Academy. It's also an important site, I think, as sort of for its architecture. We do get people coming to visit it, and it's a real palimpsest of different styles architects have worked on it, changed it. It was an original 17th century town palace. We've now taken on a new building, which was Burlington Gardens, which was built by John Pennethorne in the 1890s, and they've been joined up by David Chipperfield. So you can sort of encounter William Kent, Norman Shaw, David Chipperfield, Norman Foster, all in sort of moment of one another. But architecture, as I say, has been present from the beginning and has had different roles over time as well. The top left there is William Chambers, the architect of Somerset House, who was the first treasurer, who was the government architect at the time. Sorry, not the government architect, the architect to King George at the time. And he was the first treasurer. The architects sort of holding the purse strings. John Soane was one of our probably most famous professors of architecture, and his lectures were renowned that he gave in the Royal Academy schools between 1810 to 20 in his role as Professor of Architecture, and really had a quite novel approach to architecture and theory, which was expressed through these lectures and beautiful drawings and illustrations. We have a collection of casts that were brought in because the original teaching was very much from casts at that time. That little drawing down there shows that the down bottom in the right-hand corner there, that is a sort of layout of the large annual exhibition, and down in the right is the architecture room of the summer, which is the summer exhibition. So it has always had a room and a space and a presence within the summer exhibition. At the top right is Farshid Musavi's diploma work, which is actually one of the most beautiful ones I think we've got, which is a sort of examination of one project through a book that sort of folds out, becomes physical. And down the right, I just have included this. It's a proposed remodelling of Hyde Park Corner, which was done. There was such a thing as the Royal Academy Planning Committee, who were asked for their advice about the remodelling and reshaping of London post-war, and the Academy played an interesting role, I guess, within society at the time of being leaders of giving advice. You know, it had originally come from a place of taste, then to giving sort of architectural advice at a level of doing it. Architectural exhibitions are not new at the Academy either. We have been doing them, they have been there. There's a very large exhibition that took over all of the main galleries where the summer exhibition is. I'm referring to these galleries. I mean, they're sort of 1,200 square metres of space. They're huge and vast spaces. Back in 1937. And it was looking at British architecture that was organised by Typology. There was then a show in 1968 of 50 Years of Bauhaus. There was a show of Alvo Alto here, which is 1978. This one at the top is New Architecture, which was Foster Rogers Sterling, which was really, that again was in the main galleries, about half the main galleries. And it was the show that launched them into the public sphere. And then we've had there was a show on Goldfinger, there was one on Wren, Isazaki, Kusakawa, Lasden, John Soane. Then we had these in the last sort of 15 years, Building the Revolution, Palladio, Richard Rogers. So there really has been a lot of shows that have taken place over time at the Academy. This is a little kind of quick summary, I guess, that I started to think about in a bit of reflection, and it's a kind of incredibly incomplete sort of moment of doing it, but I was thinking about some of the key moments that have taken place, and there's a shift really where the Academy started to bring in programming, and this sort of rise of the notion of an architecture program, which dates back to about 1990 when the first annual architecture lecture was taking place. There had been lectures under Marianne Stevens when she came to the Royal Academy with some of those previous exhibitions, but I think the annual architecture lecture was quite a significant moment. It was given in 1990 when we opened the Sackler Galleries there by Norman Foster, and subsequently was given by an international architect. There was then an endowment that came in, given by Drew Hines, with the intention of establishing a centre for architecture, and there was briefly a curator of architecture there that then evolved into something else, and the Royal Academy finally, and the idea was that centre of architecture might have been in Burlington Gardens, which was a building that we finally purchased in 2000 and had. There was a moment where the Royal Academy Forum was established in 2000, which is quite important, which is bringing artists and architects together to have conversations about kind of ideas and sort of intellectual ideas, and it was a forum where the arts came together. We had the first sort of space, which was a sort of ramp down of an architecture space, which is a permanent presence of architecture, which was just free for the public. The sort of word curator came back in 2005, and as then there have been numerous people holding both program curators and obviously the Hines curator, which I've got, but there's been a number of really great colleagues who have held that role and have contributed to this program. A formation, and this is kind of quite interesting institutional things, but a kind of formation of a fixed architecture department, because previously architecture had sort of not existed as a department itself. And I think these things are quite interesting when they start to become formalised within places, and what that starts to mean. the establishment of the RE Lates program, which came out of sort of a broad interest that sort of happened within architecture, that then became a standalone thing, which Imogen Willits has been an absolute master of, and is now, I think, teaching at Kingston as well. But there's a kind of origins of those things, of what this has also spawned off, and books by someone like Owen Hopkins, who did this book, and there's a whole series of amazing people who have worked on this program as it's developed. And a real moment, I guess, in 2018, when the Royal Academy celebrated its 250th anniversary, which is both a moment to look back and also to think to the future. There was a refurbishment by David Chipperfield, which also had a new architecture studio in it, an awards program as well, which was launched. And actually, it was a reaffirmation of architecture's kind of, I think it was a chance for the Royal Academy to say how important architecture was to it and how central it remains. And it's a really interesting place, I think, positive place of which we now look to the future, and Vicky takes this on. But I just wanted, really quickly, I think architecture, as Andrew alluded to, is actually a real challenge to bring into the galleries, and often necessitates lots of different forms of engagement, and discourse is one of them. So often what we've thought about here is, thinking about this platform that we have to a culturally aware public, the clients, the influencers, as well as the architectural audience, and how you use that platform to best advantage, and lots of different ways in which we've done so on lots of different registers, with some great people doing programming across that, and also awards. And these activations, and I think the activations are really important and quite interesting, this idea of staging experiences, because architecture is something that is lived and we occupy. It doesn't sit there statically. It's quite an interesting thing to test and to play our relationship to it in lots of different ways. And it has then spawned things like, out of the architecture program, strangely, of doing a sort of arts festival that took over, broke free of the building, went into the threshold and the spaces around the urban context of Mayfair in which the Academy exists, changing the way in which that's viewed, as I said, the Lates program, and then also residencies, and these things actually that start to animate or change the discussion we have about architecture. And then exhibiting, and I think exhibiting falls across many different things. As I said, we had this first thing, this sort of architecture space on the side, and actually I have curated and worked in all of these different spaces, and it's a really interesting way in which you have to think about, people used to curse this kind of oversteep ramp down a very unglamorous space for architecture, but actually it was a real challenge and an interesting space to think about how you engage people, and a sort of testing zone, because people wouldn't necessarily be intending to come. How did you make them stop? There's Peter Cook painting the walls red and putting his, investing, as he said, his drawings all around it. Gonzalo Herrero did this amazing program in the architecture studio as well for sort of 2 or 3 years when we moved into Burlington Gardens. That again was a challenging space, but actually that challenging space became something in which to play against. And so we've often had those things, also then doing commissions outside. There's one actually here in Singapore and one outside the Royal Academy, but there's a real mix of those, how, I guess, the sort of variety of which this has been done and worked upon, and how we've been thinking about architecture in somewhere like the Academy. And for me, it really is actually about how these things come together. And so I guess when I talk about curating, I have to think about all of it. And I think it's also the really nice thing about actually where it's sat within the Academy has been, every other department is about output. There's an exhibitions department, a learning department, a collections department, and they're about what they look after. Where we're the only subject-based department, and that has had people who deal with programming, with exhibiting, with displays, with this sort of festival stuff, with publications. And that's to say it's a big department. It's sort of at its maximum, it's been 4 people. But actually, everyone's worked together and shared and cross-pollinated ideas. And I think that's a really important way in which it's thought about quite holistically, and thinking about the best mode through which to explore ideas and think about how that can take place. Now, next chapter, I was going to move on to focusing, as I said, that I would be doing it, about exhibiting architecture. And but I did want to talk about it because I do think it sits within the broader framework and context in which we might think about it. And I think, especially when I thought about the kind of why, while I think that all of those other I can put a echo there. While everything's important, the amazing thing about exhibitions is the scale of the audience one can reach, and also thinking about the legacy that has. And I've always thought about, I guess, exhibiting as quite a spatial and a physical thing, and that's again my training as an architect. But I mean, very briefly, I guess exhibiting architecture does fall into many different categories. You know, there's the building as exhibit. So you'll be familiar with all of these, but then there's the pavilions, which have then risen up as a testing ground for ideas. There's the rise of the biennales and the triennales, which are often very specific or unspecific to a place, but there's often a very liveness to which these things are turned around and information is presented. And then there's exhibitions within galleries, and I think there's often a sort of slow mechanism, actually. I think it's sort of represented how you see some of these things even by the imagery of what they're presenting. You know, there's form across to the sort of the monographic shows and the ideas. You know, the Modern Architecture International Exhibition was a real moment in which modernism reached a kind of different sphere and became sort of a style. And then there's the sort of manifesto projects like the sort of ones that OMA, that Koolhaas has put on recently with the Countryside and the Guggenheim. So I think there's so many different ways in which this sphere of architecture is thought about. I'll just talk very briefly about a couple of different projects that I've worked on, just because I guess the sort of proximity of them. The Renzo Piano exhibition, and I think that when actually thinking about what sort of exhibition program we wanted to put together at the Academy, it was always one of a sort of mixed program that would represent the Academy as a sort of artist-led institution, artist and architect-led institution. So it's also about, you know, going into the mind of that architect, but it's also about the cross-pollination of ideas, and that while monographic shows are really important, also there'd be sort of one every 3 years or something, and then there's actually exhibitions about ideas that the RA can do, so that actually and perhaps also thinking, you know, the relevance of historic exhibitions as well, because, you know, the contemporary and the present moment is always contextualised in relationship to the historic, and actually how we could do historic exhibitions in a particularly relevant way. So that's sort of the thinking on it. And so, but I mean, I did pause on the monographic, because there is a way for a public in which to sort of absorb and to step into the world of an architect. There's a sort of curiosity, I think, that people have about, and there's a curiosity and a kind of unknownness about what an architect does. And I think that one particular value, perhaps, of a monographic show is also thinking about being able to expose the value of what an architect brings, you know, the layers of which they think, from design to conceptual to realization, and actually how one holds to an idea. And that there's often, you know, conversation, people say, oh, architects are so expensive, we can't afford it, but actually what one gets within that process, and how they work, and the kind of context in which they work becomes really, I think, quite interesting and revealing. And I think, and that ability to reach a general audience in it. I mean, we had 77,000 people come to Renzo, which is obviously far beyond the London architecture audience. And I think it's a great process in which that can take place. And then thinking about those shows, giving people access points. And so that one way in terms of thinking about curatorial kind of strategy in this was having different layers of information, so that on the bottom right there you've got the sort of general information about the project. So if you want to sort of to understand what it is, you can read that. There's a sort of hierarchy of information. Then every object had a label if you wanted to go down to that level, but then the objects were also grouped in kind of certain ideas. That was talking about kind of the way in which the facade worked, for instance, in the Shard, and actually there was a little grouping that spoke about actually the role of facades and what it did. And so that if you wanted to just go and look at a top line, you could, but if you wanted to geek out and find out about each of those projects, there's a way to do that. And also then bring the architect's voice into the centre. And I think Renzo is especially poetic and good at talking about architecture and capturing it, particularly for a public audience. And that sort of voice of his voice, I think, was quite a beautiful theme in the centre. Was also this kind of fantasy island that he put together, which was 104, I think. Maybe it was about 80 of his projects, all at the same scale, at 1 to 500. And so you could actually start to understand the scale and the range of projects he had worked on, And it was a sort of little game as well to see if we could discover what they were or recognise what they were. This kind of, there was a slightly playful thing that he was doing in that room as well, and sort of in his sort of sphere of thinking about it as a space of imagination. I've then worked on a number of other shows like this one with Thomas Heatherwick. It was a very different process with working with Thomas. Actually, Thomas let me go into his archive really deeply, and then propose an exhibition structure to him, and a conversation came up, and then they designed it in response to what that ethos was. I was looking at some 3 key things of thinking, making, gosh, no, I can't remember it, and that's too long ago, so I'm having a real middle of the night moment. And then, importantly in that, guys, is also to acknowledge, as I said, we'd had at the Academy, we have been doing shows that do hit at different registers. And this is the last exhibition, which was at the RA, which wasn't one I personally curated. It was someone in my team, Gonzalo, who did this. But it was taken from a show which had been touring around Europe, a thesis that was developed around, called Eco Visionaries, which was looking at sort of climate and ecological emergency, and how artists in particular and architects can show us, make these connections and make real and present within the galleries what this emergency is, and then a kind of way in which architects then respond to it on the right. And I think it's really important to be tackling some of these big issues, and I think there's an interesting role in which exhibitions can play at doing that. But what I wanted to focus on, and when I started to, I guess, think about the context of some of these different shows and how I might start to organise, at least in my mind, some of how sort of categories that exhibitions fall into, and I haven't done a particularly comprehensive thing mapping that out, but that for me there is a certain category of exhibition or type of exhibition that I'm especially interested in, which is this idea that exhibitions as a means to not necessarily express or represent what we already know, but a way of uncovering, discovering things we don't. And that is also in their proposition and what they generate, and in the process of their making, that something reveals itself. And I think that is a slightly different process to some of the exhibitions that I've shown previously, where you'll bring works together within an existing framework. And so this might be in one way of creating new works, or sort of entirely new works altogether, but also creating them within a particular framework. So I need some more water, but I didn't. So I'm going to look at, in this, I'm actually going to think about 2 different kind of lenses through this, or ways of which I've worked on projects. One which is where an architectural practice has been exploring this for themselves, and one where it's been sort of more as a curatorial practice that has delved into that. And I think the 2 dovetail and interlock. But I guess for me, as I go back to what I was saying before, and also I think particularly curatorially when I've been thinking about it, I've always thought about exhibitions as sort of a spatial and creative practice, and as well as a research-based practice. But it's also those things of actually how one gives form to an exhibition, and that they are sort of sites, that they can also become sites of experimentation. And I guess there is something, and this idea of why it's sort of spatial and creative practice, to my mind, is also understanding that it is bringing ideas into a physical context that we encounter in some ways, and we encounter these things with others as well. So there's a kind of social aspect to an exhibition, of encountering things in space and ideas in space. And I think there's a real thing you can play with about how the ideas become more present or otherwise through constructing them spatially, if that's how they're laid out, or how they're emphasized, and they're emphasized in a kind of in as I say, in space, which is thinking about, sort of brings in a sort of architectural knowledge. I was going to just talk really briefly about 2 projects which came to mind that fall into this, guys. And I have been working on an exhibition with Goodwin, which was intended to take place in this autumn, but we've had to postpone it for reasons which I'll sort of explain at the end. But it's been a really interesting process of, one, them delving into their they've really seen exhibitions as projects in their own right, as sites of experiment of which their own practice, architectural thinking has progressed, and that this very specific context of exhibiting has provided a way of sort of consolidating and expressing ideas. Lego House here it was one of the first key objects or things they did towards an exhibition. Sorry, my slider's not working. Oh, there it is.
Oh.
There we are. But so they've always been interested in the ideas of the tools we have to translate. Again, I think that it's the essence of translating. How do you translate the conceptual, intellectual, emotional, experiential ideas of architecture into an exhibition space, but also how you understand how we think around tools of perception that also might inform practice, and so that they, in thinking about exhibitions, they also think about tools of perception that is part of how they think about their practice and their own development, critiquing development of ideas, and within a project itself. So this is an early exhibition they did called Denkenform, Architecture Denkenform, and it was in the Architecture Museum in Basel, and they were playing with the idea. There's a whole series of ideas, I guess, that comes out in their work, which is around the role of the buildings occupied in the city, the image, the facade, as a conveyor of messages, of meaning, the role that materials play within that. And they did this project where they screen printed two of their projects onto the glass of the galleries, that then you then read them in relationship to the city beyond it, and kind of opening up a conversation for the audience of perception, of calling into question this idea of perception, the role architecture plays within the city. And the next level that they then went to was also that these projects are things that are that they're interconnected as well. They then pursued that of abstracting it to the next zone, that they then represent it in another form of representation. Someone starts to engage with the idea of the image represented to you. So previous exhibition represented, and then there was kind of some other footage that went with that. So you understood the context in which it was doing. So it's these layers of presentation, representation that came in place. And then this was a sort of third iteration where this was then filmically shown in another way, and then you experience it through a different mechanism, that being the television and the screen. But that then is a bit progressing sort of intellectual ideas they have around tools of perception. At the same time, it's also informs us to think around that reinforms architecture, and these are early projects they were doing about then screen printing facades, quite basically here in the Suva House, and then became much more elaborate in the library, where the imagery from books comes out, working with an artist, a really beautiful project there. And so you can see that these ideas are also long trajectories that sort of start that are sort of prompted in being able to operate in spaces that are outside of just being built. This is again the Swiss Pavilion that they participated in 1991, where they invited, I think it was 4 or 6 artists to sort of take portraits and to capture their buildings. So looking at their buildings through the eyes of another, and what an artist represents back through their own perception and perceives from the building and represents back. So looking at their work through another lens of these layers of understanding its context. And this then spawned a whole series of ongoing dialogues then with someone like Thomas Ruth, that they then put their own work, these models, in dialogue with. And it's quite interesting, and it's kind of they talk very much about these as portraits of buildings, and that they are those sort of personal portraits that enables a way of reading and them seeing their architecture differently, but then presenting it differently. then to another exhibition, which was again part of an ongoing discourse with Lenny Zorg. And so in this case, they actually gave it over to Zorg as a curator, as an artist. It was all about perception, who they'd had a long dialogue with, and he wanted to democratise all of the work. And so all of these work is shown flat with fluorescent lights above, which kind of makes your reading, which brings it democratises all work, but also it makes you aware and have to be active in the reading of what one is looking at in terms of the projects and how they're presented. And so there's quite a creative act that they're playing upon this idea of perception, where the visitor is actively moving in and out of different registers of perception, which is what they're interested in, then informs also their architecture. Another show, this is a show that they curated much more themselves, I'm taking it back, which was number 250. So number 250 is also the project number, and it also gives importance to the fact that this was for them a project, as was the Tate Modern, as it was the Scharlager, which is the building that they did it in. And it was a real interest in the kind of development of the tool, and so an ongoing thing is the development of the tools the architect has to hand to work and to develop ideas and to see their ideas, which was suddenly the laser cutting and all of these tools that meant you could suddenly create hundreds of objects, testing forms, and how that started to change and shape their architectural process. So this relationship between the tool to hand and the process, and the one that is testing in it. And then that was the start of them also thinking about this next project, which was the cabinet, which is their archive. So how they archive and how they think about presenting their own work to themselves as an archive that's also active. It's a way of understanding their work moving forward, and it's something that's present within their process and thinking and practice. And that how the exhibition informs the intellectual structure, the physical structure, all of the things that go into this idea of the cabinet, of delving into it and it being on display. And we were working on a really exciting show where they were really pushing what the tools are available to the architect and to us now, that we're also working into the sort of digital virtual sphere, that is now that's a commonplace tool of the architect, and how that can be brought into an exhibition to transcend the relationship or that problem between sorry, I'm really a bit dehydrated and dizzy.
You can take a break if you want, Kate. Sorry, it's great. But I don't
I'm like, hold on. I just need to get. Yeah, I've got to go down the corridor and get water, so I'm not going to go and do that. I'll just go. But so it was an amazing show that we had, which we've had to postpone because we want to be able to realise it in sort of a post-COVID world where it can be fully experienced. But so it's a really live project, and I think that was really interesting watching them in parallel develop ideas as a real testing ground to whole sphere of a whole portion of this exhibition, which was breaking new territory for them in their own practice and what they're doing, where it's going, and then maintaining that research process. But I think it's a really interesting way in which, for an architect, it can be a sphere of stepping outside of the built project into this sphere of presenting it in an exhibition context, which is necessarily a dialogue with an audience, and what that process does for you thinking about architecture. Then I'm going to move, sorry, that's not up there, to talk about Sensing Spaces, which was then a show which I did, which was also, I was trying to capture something, and I used this picture by Ellen Benet of in Zumthor's thermal baths in Basel to talk about this kind of really difficult, the sensation we have in inhabiting space, which is deeply physical, psychological, emotional, it's temporal, it's complex, that we bring memories, all things, actions to it. And it is the kind of magic of architecture. It's the thing almost that is beyond description, and certainly didactic description. It's something that we share. And I was interested in how you could try and bring this into a gallery space. And particularly it's a thing that I think is most resonant with the public too, to get them to engage with those things that they might not have thought about themselves, of how they've come in and experienced architecture. And it was a real challenge to say, okay, how do you bring those things in, which are almost difficult to write down and describe? There are some beautiful texts, I think, that start to it, and these photographs start to allude to it, but it's always that thing that's a little bit beyond. So I was trying to think about the challenge, and it really was an experiment. How could you bring that into a gallery space? And it was an experiment. I didn't know in some ways whether it would work. It was took over all of the main galleries, which is the first time it had done since 1987. Architecture had been in there. It was very publicly focused. I worked with these 7 architects on the side to think about how they could overcome some of these challenges. And it was interesting that it wanted to tune the visitor's antennae to the physical and emotional encounter with space. It wasn't going to contain any representation, so it was actually using architecture as the primary method of communication. So we were communicating through architecture rather than through representations of it to talk about it. And I guess it was also challenging, can architecture communicate in that way? It was something that became a sort of question, a sort of experiment as to whether it would do so. And in that process, it was a process of discovery and discovering something. And this sense of turning a visitor from being active to more passive, to turning their antenna on, that awareness, how architecture could shift in a register from being background to foreground. And in thinking, the whole conception of it was really thinking about the audience and the visitor and that person who was coming to it, and actually how one would work within those sorts of registers. And it was really important to sort of meet people and give them space to come in themselves, to encounter the exhibition as a thing on their own terms, being informed by their own architectural experience rather than it being about what the architect's intentions or either my intentions, only those intentions are there. So what I'll sort of run through. I'm not going to talk about necessarily the shows because there's different bits and stuff on the website about it. I've spoken about it lots. But just in this context, this is the scale of the show. And I think it is quite architectural. Like we had this as a map, a sort of a guide for people to walk around. It's kind of like exploring a city. There's lots of analogies I think I was making or bringing from architecture to even thinking about curatorial structure programming. They weren't given, the architects weren't given a space to start with. We started talking about ideas, and then the ideas started to take form, and then I started to give them a sort of spatial relationship. Like as soon as Kengo Kuma was talking about this sort of dark, internal, intimate space with these very fine pieces of bamboo, sort of put them here at the end so you go into it and you'd return out of it. There's sort of sense that, not a dead end, but the spatial conditions that the galleries enabled could actually enhance the experience he was wanting to do, and how contrast would work, certain relationships from one to the other. Could be played upon, synergies between the two. These two up here, a dialogue between a couple of the different works, but then also contrast. And none of the architects knew what the other was doing, so I was in some ways working a little bit like a conductor or director, nuancing and pushing them. And I knew what was going on in the different spaces. So it's this sort of quite an interesting, evolving process of discovery and uncovery with architecture itself. And at the very end here was a film. So there was very minimal text. It sort of told the architect's name, where they were located, size of practice, really what the thing was made of. It was really sort of really factual and technical, rather than offering any interpretation of the work. That was all for the visitor to come across. But there was one sort of quote from the architect which captured some sort of spiritual provocation for thought or something, and this kind of idea that they were putting something into the space which was a dialogue, both what they said, but also this work which was in a process. And then right at the end here, so all of that was open. People could go whichever way, backwards and forwards, that they wanted to. At the last space here was a film, which you would exit through and go into the shop, because that's the way that the Royal Academy had to do it. Exit through the gift shop. There's a reason we do it. And that film was a beautiful film, which is actually online by Candida Richardson, which was looking at, who's worked a lot with artists. There's both digital and analog filming in it. And it was an artist's eye. It was less documentary. It was sort of an impressionistic, but it had each of the architects speaking in it. And actually one of the biggest compliments I got from people was that they were frustrated. They said they had to go back and revisit the show having seen the film. And it was exactly that the reason for putting it at the end was that people went free into this thing without knowing those things, carrying those sorts of baggage. They bring themselves in and then had to return on themselves. And that then invitation to go back and then to see it through a different lens, if should they so choose. I mean, this gives you a bit of a sense of the scale of these things. This is galleries, and this is, you know, a 3-metre high building that takes you up into these, behind those columns of these amazing staircases. It was about movement. It was about moving vertically to discover a world above which no one ever gets to see, in different proximity. So it's in some ways understanding the architecture differently. It's understanding what the sense of movement, what it is to move from one space to another vertically. Correlations with their own work. Francis Kere had this space which was about forcing people to move more tightly together. There's a real way in which he was hoping to activate the audience, which it really did. People put these straws in this form change, there was a kind of looseness to what would happen. It wasn't precious about that. It was about what happened in it more than what it was itself. There were spaces like this by Grafton, which was paring back to a real elemental aspect of architecture, that of light. And so for me, it was really as much not just about those single big pieces, but actually about how these moments build up and sensations and the overall experience came together. And so the atmosphere of this, we worked with a sonographer to think around actually just weaving these things together. And, you know, it's also the way in which the sites we go to become, you know, so in some ways the Academy was both brought into focus, sometimes it was pushed into the background. So there's constant dialogue, I think, of architectural ideas that come up in some of these things, both in the reception but also in, I think, structuring some of the curatorial process. I guess this is about some of those relationships again, which for me was about the dialogue with the architecture and things between as much as it was. And the sensation of inhabiting, that you might carry an experience of walking up the Peso Von Erich House and things that you then, that informs, or maybe you just carry it into how you then walk through this space, the next space. And I think there's two things that this does by way of, for me, in terms of this sort of experimental process. One is that it changed within the institution a huge amount of what it is to exhibit in these galleries. And it's sort of a quote by Gormley, where he was saying, so it's Gormley show 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, where he just, you know, he cites sensing spaces as something which changed how you sort of saw those galleries as well. And actually using the volume of the spaces and actually how it informed his thinking about then shaping his own show in those spaces. And it also opened up some junctions about how our attitude with visitors, that there was a freedom to how they could inhabit it. The doors came off. There was a whole thing that changed actually how we had to market it. It was an incredibly difficult show to market. You know, how do you talk about experience? How do you picture that? We couldn't put a picture of Picasso on the front. There was nothing we knew to be able to put on the front. So there's a whole lot of stuff that it challenged the institution to think about, in thinking more broadly about exhibition making. And I think that there is something I find in curating architecture that also then informs how we think about curating more broadly, because of the challenges it presents, or also perhaps the opportunities it presents. And then I think it then also changes how we think about architecture, informs architectural practice. What I've become really interested in is a little bit about things we started to do about a sort of performative practice. So I'm slightly missing a slide between all of this. Maybe I'll go back to here to talk about it. But understanding how people reacted to these different spaces. There's a really, I've become interested especially in exhibitions as performative spaces, because they are a way in which a public and audience is presented with ideas in physical space, of which they start to become actors in some form. And it was very evident in sensing spaces. We also then commissioned some dancers to start to move through this space, and in doing that it also made me see these interventions quite differently. It changed a certain dynamic in it, of how somebody who is very aware of their body might look at it. So it becomes quite an interesting microcosm to examine a whole series of different ideas in architecture. This conversation that someone had with me too about the fact that they felt that they had permission in this exhibition in a way they hadn't otherwise to be in exhibitions at the Royal Academy. So there had been a lot to exhibitions there, but there was something in this, and they were a non-architect, that enabled them to inhabit or to think about the context of these galleries and exhibitions differently. And it opened up a whole series of things that I've been interested in then about the idea of permission and who has permission, particularly when you start to think around institutions like the Royal Academy, the sort of barriers of inclusion and exclusion that exist across a lot of what we do. There's a field of work. This is again going back to moving in different registers and actually how certain thinking in the exhibition context and informed thinking about then how we inhabit our buildings and use them as a critique. And this is actually a project that Laura, I know, who's working, is in the call, also worked with me on to start with it as well, and then we continued it. And there's a kind of, there is a sort of interesting critical space, I think, that exhibitions play in this bigger dialogue. So, I mean, for me, I guess in some ways, I guess it opened, I'm not sure that this is rounded out, even as I'm talking, I'm not sure it's particularly rounded, so sort of apologies. But that there is, I guess, a few things that have left for me that I'm particularly interested in, I guess, that's a little bit unresolved, and it is this kind of this sort of blurring with the performative. And thinking about isolating pursuing a certain type of exhibitions, which is the kind of experimental, where the exhibition in itself becomes a form of testing what can be made present within space, and whether it's some complex abstract ideas might be explored within an exhibition. I think when I was looking at Sensing Spaces, it was about experience. I've been very interested in the idea of time and kind of cultural aspects of time, and so there's an impossibility. I think there's something interesting about bringing the kind of emotional experience into an exhibition. There's a similar impossibility, which is also the challenge or invitation for me, of also bringing the idea of time into an exhibition, which is such a fixed temporal thing in itself. And there's a sphere of ideas there that I think one can also borrow from artists who also pursue durational work, and actually thinking around how architecture might be brought, or ideas about architecture can be brought in, borrowing from other disciplines and thinking. So that's a kind of body of work. I'm also really interested in this idea of the teaching of curatorial practice within to architecture students, because I think that, and it's not to produce a bunch of curators necessarily, but there's a really interesting space in which it occupies, which is in parallel sort of different form of research space. And it's different from writing because it's spatializing ideas, and it's the ability to sort of bring them into a dialogue with an audience in a spatial context, which I think is a really important thing for architects to do, because our work exists within a sort of social, political context with people, and testing them, which is, I think, the reason Herzl Moore is interested in this too. It's bringing it into that lens in a very particular space to do it. And I think that thinking through some of those things is quite an important and interesting aspect. And I think, and also, I mean, there's some really basic things about curatorial thinking, which is also relevant, I think, to architects and pedagogy, but also to students and how to work forward, is also thinking about how you frame and contextualize ideas and your own ideas and locate them within a broader sphere of knowledge, but then also how one edits and presents it. And I think that students often will, at every stage you have to stand up and do a crit. It is in some ways a degree of sort of curatorial thinking that goes into what do I present, how I form the emphasis on it. And I think everyone's probably always done it when one image is too big, and then the critics all just jump on that image, and actually you realise that there was another image which was perhaps more important, and that actually where the information was. And there's a similar thing in curatorial practice, actually, how you emphasise different things, give them space, lay them out. And in the exhibition context, you've also got a sort of spatial relationship, which is about choreographing movement, the visitor's eye, the visitor's movement from one thing to another, what they see in relation, sort of certain spatial relationships that have come up, that you look at one thing that you might turn to see another. And I think these are really quite interesting. I think they're architectural principles that we can start to think. So enabling the space to think about these things, and a thing that isn't in building, I think is a really valuable and interesting strand of knowledge. And then I'm also, I guess the last thing that kind of sits with me is something about the institution. And I'm kind of excited, as Andrew said, and as I mentioned, I'm stepping away from this role after 17 years. And I guess I realise I carry the institution, a lot of its knowledge. It's been fascinating to watch it go, but also breaking free of it conceptually, physically, being in Mayfair, what it is. And often we've done that in little ways of breaking free, as I said, sort of festivals that broke free of the boundaries of it. And I think it's really interesting to take curatorial practice into different forms, into the urban realm. And I'm interested in kind of where it might go beyond the gallery, and how you can work at different levels of activation or animation by bringing some of these thinking across into new contexts. That's a kind of really not very good, unsuccinct summary of where I've got to. I'm sorry, my brain has literally just dried up.
I disagree. That was beautiful, cogent, incredibly well constructed, Kate. So I disagree. I really enjoyed the talk and these open questions at the end, kind of positing, what you've gained, and then in terms of questions, I think they're opening up. I mean, while we're waiting, just in terms of the audience, by all means, you can unmute and just speak and ask questions directly. Okay.
Should I get rid of this slide, or does it not matter because we end up talking anyway? Because we can't see one another.
If you get rid of the slide, if you get rid of the slide, people will see you slightly bigger on their screen.
Oh, I don't want that.
I'd say it might be. It's all about humanizing things.
It is all about humanizing. Yeah. We can't hide behind these screens anymore, can we? On only side I can see you, so I can have a conversation with someone, which is nice, isn't it?
Well, I mean, there are nicer people here to have a conversation with. I'm interested in, just while we're waiting for others to come in with their questions, I'm interested in this. Underlying a lot of what you're actually saying is this unspoken thing of trust, in the sense of, there's trust in your own ability to land some incredibly complex things. I mean, I can only imagine what the logistics were for Sensing Spaces, both to convince on an institutional level that a show that risky and that expensive would work, but then also trust in the sense of you trusting your ability to land and choreograph the emerging architectures from these firms, but then I think more explicitly as well, trusting the protagonists, the architects, to deliver something that will be of value as the audience, but also to architecture more generally. And I think what's intriguing about that is that, I mean, it isn't something we've gone through very often being curated as an architect. It's happened 4 or 5 times to us, but there has been experiences where it's been based on profound distrust, where effectively the curator is designing a box, and sort of an intellectual box, and it's all this kind of card game that you sort of have to land on the landing pad that they've already preordained for you. And then there are the more liberating ones where it's sort of not even on the level that you're talking about, but there is this trust, and they're the ones that are really beneficial and risky, I think, for the curators. And I guess my question is quite a simple one in one level, which is the nerve required in that, the kind of balancing of those forces. Like, that is not an easy job to do, and it has parallels with architecture. But in an architecture practice, you have solidarity in the design team, and you have you have all these other things, and there's clear stages to that process. And I'm just interested in how you developed that side of your curatorial practice that, I guess, places a burden on you as a curator. But I'm just interested in that, because it requires that for any of this to be possible, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think, I mean, when you're talking, I mean, it's most akin really to a client architect. I mean, it's akin to a client architect relationship, and also the best project comes out of a position of shared trust and understanding. But, the best projects come out when your client trusts you and you trust your client, and that is developed over a period of time. So I would say it's in some ways entirely the same thing. You end up, you have to be a good client. In some ways, actually, you have to be a patron. where you're taking something beyond of, acting into, also beyond yourself too. Because I think there's a number of things and I think I probably learnt the most through talking to colleagues who curate art, working with contemporary artists. I mean, you have to trust them, and they have to trust you. And I guess which is something that is strangely more fractured. Maybe it's not. Is it more difficult for us to think about sometimes in architects? Often because architecture, there is so much money in that. There's this sort of financial. There's so many kind of layers of complexity in that relationship, where that's not always the case with an artist. And I think I learned quite a lot from talking to colleagues, and the ability to control, and also like humility of actually stepping back, of also having to trust, and actually being pulled up on that you do have to give trust. You have to trust yourself and your judgment that you've made the right selection, and that they will then do what you want. So there's those things in it. But I did think a lot about trust, and it was a process that built up, particularly with Sensing Spaces, over a long period of time. But I think with every show you always work on is being able to get to that next level. Also somebody like Thomas Heatherwick, who did trust me, I think, to stand back and to let me go through his archive. And to be in the background of crits. Sometimes I'd be there and sort of duck away so he didn't see me, so I wasn't conscious. But that takes a huge level of trust on both parties. But I think also with trust, I also always coupled it with the idea of responsibility, because within that, I felt a huge responsibility to the architects. There was moments of which, I particularly say Sensing Spaces, that they had trusted me, which was such, and I had their reputation. I had them, in some ways, it was them that was going up on stage, not me, and that responsibility was kind of, in some ways, a couple of moments always breaking. I was like, God, it's fine. If this is terrible, I can just come back here and sit on the beach in Australia and disappear off the world. Their work is out there, and they've got a whole business, and so that was a real responsibility. But then also the responsibility towards the audience, and a responsibility towards the institution. So, I think there was, interestingly, it became really present, I guess, in Sensing Spaces, that these things were highlighted. But I think one always has that with all the shows, these sort of responsibilities between, and I think it's interesting, the word curator is about care, and its origins was in care. And I've also thought about, it is caring for the material you've got, but it's caring for the people you're working with, and you've got their, you sort of hold them. You need to create that space for them too, to be able to take a risk. And it's about holding a space for somebody, and I think particularly in commissioning, and I think that's what a good client does too, doesn't it, as a patron? They hold that, they create that space for you to be creative, and for you to have, that there's a certain thing, a really good client can do that. Or certainly in commissioning things, actually, I think when you commission artists, you need to defend and give them the biggest freedom to do what they want. And so I think that there was trust that had to be built, and trust is always something that you test and you grow. So I think there is a responsibility, and also the responsibility that this would be to the audience, that they're going to come along with whatever show and be able to get something from it. And that's a huge onus, because you don't, particularly at somewhere like the Academy, particularly where there's box office on it, and if it doesn't work, you hear about it, and that there's a certain, you want people to gain something from this, because they've also invested their time, money, they've come along to something, and you want it to be at some level rewarding or enriching. So I think responsibility is quite heavy in there too.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I'm for the benefit of the audience, please cut in with your questions, because this is not the Andrew and Kate conversation. There are people here more qualified than I to ask you questions, Kate, which is why we're having you. But I just wanted to say, I enjoyed, and I found that piano show quite moving in a way, that that central room, with that beautiful interview with him, which sort of really reminded you of where he came from, and the humanism of that, and the conversation about sailing and all of that, and this island, which actually, it's interesting, it was more about the connection back to those amazing pieces that you had recovered or had placed in particular places, like the scruffy handmade Menil collection.
Yeah, he didn't want to show
which
that.
Was,
that was about trust. He did not want to show it.
That was amazing. You know,
Yeah.
in the sense that when you were in the room from a distance, it didn't operate, and then you get close to it and you're in its cartilage and it binds you, and that kind of associative stepping, well, to the video and back to that kind of pieces. I found that really beautiful in that show, you know, that oscillation, and that it doesn't have to make narrative sense at all points, and that you trust the people to kind of engage with that. And I think that's also why that show works for architects and for the general public, which Sensing Spaces did also. Um,
An interesting
um,
point on that actually is, as a curator, I think, you know, the film was a really big part of, you know, I think it set a certain tone of atmosphere. There was a lot in it, you know, it was a really important thing, and that was also then, you know, the only bit I can take credit for, you know, choosing the filmmaker, talking to him about stuff, and then it was him, you know, it was his thing. So actually, which could have made or broke the show, you know, that could have, handing that to him, that central space, actually was the, like, a real essence of the show. Could he capture the essence that I saw, or that we saw, that Renzo saw? And actually, there's a really nice, you know, I think that's something quite interesting in that process too, that you learn to give over, and to see what somebody else's imagination is able to bring to fore, perceives, understands. You know, he's a non-architect, so how does he come to this? What are the questions that he asked of Renzo? Because he did a lot of the interviews. I don't think I was present for the interviews with Renzo either. You know, like, we had conversations before and did an informing thing. So it's a really, I think it really goes to that thing of trust, and quite an interesting role that happens. You know, when you work with an artist or somebody else in it, that's the lovely thing.
well, there are other forms of curatorial practice in architecture that are slightly different to the thing you're talking about, which is why I think it's worth surfacing these conversations. Do you know what I mean? And I'm not talking about anyone in specific here, but there are curators who are foregrounded and named, and who are, there is a care, but there's a different thing happening. It's a curatorial practice that is about positioning them as much as anything else, and I think that's legitimate. But I find that the work that you do is quite interesting because it's so varied, and it really. Anyway, I'm actually talking. I've been told, Kate, that I have to leave 180 seconds of silence, and then people start to fill it with questions, and I'm just really bad at that.
Yeah, I mean, like, I do think, I think that there's a very particular form of, like, you know, I think there's really important curatorial work also, which is operating and identifying. You know, I think what's interesting is there are so many different forms of curatorial practice and ways in which they progress ideas and present ideas and approaches and things that are much more based on theory and then testing theories. And I think that, you know, I've had a couple of conversations with other curators, and we're very different. And possibly I come very closely from architecture and sort of creative process, and that's where I'm kind of interested in. And I think there's a certain place for that, but also there's a real place for other ways of curating as well that I think that's interesting. It's a kind of, I think it is quite a rich field.
But I think there's a complexity to it. I'm thinking of conversations I had with just because I knew them, the curators of the Graft, the assistant curators who worked with Graftons on the amazing Biennale that they did. And I mean, I'm sure artists are similar, but my God, some of the stories about some of those architects were extraordinary as well. I mean, I don't really have an issue with ego. We all need ego. But there are people that are very hard to curate, and that to make something synthesized and meaningful of all of that is quite an art. I mean, they did it in that Biennale, and you do it all the time. I'm not asking you to open any sealed boxes here, but I think it's part of the trust thing, right? Which is that how do you diffuse and gently kind of coax that stuff into some kind of calm part of a collective work, which is this show or this exhibition or this conversation. Actually, it's interesting that at the start you place the discourse as a curated thing, which is absolutely true, and the crafting of a good conversation as being a place where meaning becomes present or new knowledge is generated is absolutely on point. And it's interesting that, again, that Dorfman Award that you were instrumental in setting up and kind of running and kind of helping into its existence, anyone I know who went through that process found it incredibly gracious and meaningful and valuable. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's an intensity to it, but there was also the participants gained from it, which is kind of interesting. Anyway, sorry, I've got a question, I think, in the chat. So Siobhan Sexton saying that you're a trailblazer and your curiosity and generosity of spirit, creating an amazing dialogue, which I think is true. I think that's what's I think it's hard to do that because you sort of have to allow yourself to dissolve in those places for that to happen as a catalyst, if you know what I mean.
Oh, that's a lovely thing. Thank you. I mean, I don't know. It's hard to, we all do what we do and we do it with, I think there's also been I think what's quite amazing is the people I've always worked with have been, hello, Tom, how'd you get in here? I thought, that's good. Oh, good. We can have people, but you need to unmute.
You need to unmute, Tom.
Hello, sorry, I wasn't able to join the lecture, but I wanted to watch it afterwards, so I needed to join in and get apologies. How are you doing?
Really good. Haven't seen you in a long time. That's a
No,
nice thing
I've gone to the other side of the world, haven't you?
I am on the other side of the world, yeah. And I think, it's you sort of slowly thrown out. I mean, I think context is a really interesting thing, and I think having been back here in Australia, I'm kind of aware of context. And I think something, something I'd taken for granted is this kind of, the kind of architecture discourse does sit in a kind of, that there's so many, that there are galleries dealing and thinking about architecture on lots of different levels. And I think that it's easy to take when you're in this, there's a lot happening in London, there's a lot happening in Ireland, there's actually a real kind of both richness within the architecture community, but within the public too. The fact that big galleries someone like the Royal Academy is hosting a big exhibition. We're going to try and have one every year. The V&A is doing them. The Barbican has done lots of brilliant ones. South Bank, it's a subject that people are engaging with, and that to me is really, really important and really reassuring for architecture, because it needs to move, it needs to operate in its own sphere. Sometimes I think there's something very positive about a conversation which is a little bit internal because it progresses at a different kind of level in a way. And I think that, I think the work people like the CCA have been doing, Marina's been doing, there's a lot of really great stuff happening, and that has an energy to it. And but it's, for me, also really exciting when it gets into a public sphere. And I've always been really interested in that translation of how you move into it, which is often, I guess, my starting point for some of these thinking, and the kind of challenges that poses. But it's not something that should be taken for granted. I mean, I realise I've spent many years at the Academy fighting for architecture too, because even within the Academy, sometimes it's still seen to be it's like, well, what is architecture within the arts? It's something we still have to keep articulating and keep expressing and keep understanding. And I think there's a real challenge in that. And it's an interesting challenge. It's an interesting challenge for architects who sit in and outside of it. But, it goes to that thing about, having good clients. Good clients are informed. They're confident, can trust, and I think there is a thing of if what architects do is a sort of unknown, how do they trust the unknown? And I think there's an openness in design. I've had a lot of these conversations, the iterative process of architecture and design, which goes down rabbit holes and out and not, and taking people on journeys with that is a really difficult thing, and actually, I mean, sorry, it's a whole other tangent, but I think helping people to think about what it is to be a good client. And, I learned, I stuffed up plenty, you don't always get things right and all things are trust too, you have little falters along the way, don't you? Like you do, your trust in yourself falls, your ability to see things isn't always as clear, too close to, like, God, you never get it right. but actually you need to get the thing, you need to trust that actually there's a process there and that you can falter and fail and have conflict and or not, but those things are part of a good process and relationship. I think there's so many correlations, I think. I mean, I have to thinking about these ideas that does relate to architecture. Even though
it's interesting. I mean, I do understand and I agree with you that we should talk more about these kind of practices, and a school of architecture is very much about that. But part of it is not always curating or not always editing, so that there is this disinterested third party, or more or less disinterested third party, going, actually, this thing that you're sort of not valuing over here is unbelievably compelling and beautiful, and then you place it center. And in some senses, that is part of the educational process. And it's also, I mean, you just described doing exactly that with Renzo Piano. Do you know what I mean? This scruffy thing over here that you don't want us to show is actually essential to us making sense of you. And I do think that's kind of really important aspect of it, which is that I think a lot of the self-reflective, or this kind of ability to be an engine of your own thinking, is very hard. I mean, you practice like Herzog and de Muren do it, but I think without external narration or people such as yourself stepping in and out of that space, and critics perform this role also, I think it's actually quite a difficult job to do. Do you know what I mean? I think that there's something about that interruption of practice by an exhibition. I know it's a continuation in a certain sense, but it is a different thing.
That's if you let
it's very important.
Yeah, because I think you've had to shape your own narrative so much as an architect at every, because that thing of having to sell to a client, you've had to shape and articulate what it is. And those things, I think, must become quite, how do you move beyond your own position and rhetoric and keep changing it? And the sort of thing that you've set up for yourself. And then also, because you can't flip to suddenly be something else, because then someone says to you, well, God, you don't know what you are. You're like, oh, but I've grown up. It's the sort of thing. I mean, it's not an easy thing, is how you continue to develop your own dialogue about what you are. I mean, in some ways, it's the thing that I find, I've been at the Royal Academy for 17 years. It's very hard to see yourself. I realised that I was different when I went in at 26 as a little Australian, but it's hard if you don't have those markers and you keep evolving in a practice. Actually, it's difficult to see those things. And actually, those interruptions are important. But I think it's especially difficult for an architect because the kind of lifeblood of the very essence of practice, you've got to kind of pitch or do something, and that's not a straightforward thing to do. So, yeah, things, ticketed drinks, exactly. And I think that there is, I might say something. So I think there is something important in that process. But actually, even to what Tim said there, that thinking around, when you mentioned discourse, and part of the reason I have thought about, it is the staging of the right people, but it's also sometimes the staging of the atmosphere around it. The way in which two chairs are put up can change something, and that's an architectural spatial thing that we are acutely aware of. The width of a table changes a dinner party. And these are things that a good architect just kind of understands, and I think that also in staging a conversation, that affects the dynamics of relationship with audience. The things that I was really aware of when we suddenly went into the David Chipperfield lecture theatre, that it did something really different for the events we were trying to host in there. And sometimes it's a good thing. You can subvert it and actually be surprising. And actually, Imogen did some amazing things with the Lates of actually having drag queen karaoke in there. And actually, I think I would have loved to see David in the middle of it all. I mean, it was just amazing with all these people dressed up, and the sort of way in which that space became the kind of something else, that deep horseshoe became something very performative, and it then becomes, for a very serious lecture, it gives a certain elevation, but what it does for how one has a conversation in there really changes. And I think that these are things that I'm really interested in, and that is interesting to architects, and to also to a public, to be kind of aware of the kind of way in which we occupy use space and the kind of impact this might be having, how you can subvert it, that there's agency in it, that David Chipperfield space at one level can look like that, but also it can actually feel completely differently if you start to program it, change a lens in it. Even, I went to a building the other day where I could take my coffee into the beautiful new library, and I got a coffee, and I was able to, the doors open with two sides of it. The coffee serves outside to one side of the public space, and then it also serves inside to the library. And I was like, maybe I've been in the UK and in London too. Can I take my coffee in, like around all the books? And they were like, yeah. And you just walked off with your coffee cup, and they will find that you took it into a little nook in the corner that was a lovely space to sit in, with books around. And that's also about how you operate spaces. That's a client who understands how it is to make a civic building that is a library and a community space. And that's architecture working with operation. And I think that there's I don't know, sorry, I'm now rambling down completely different tangents, but these are things that I think are kind of relevant or partake to why I go back to that thing of presenting all three: discourse, activation, exhibiting, as a holistic thing, because I don't perhaps separate them.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I was thinking of a disastrous event that I attempted to chair where the curator, they wanted me to chair a conversation between, I don't know, a couple of hundred people. I mean, these things are impossible anyway, but he'd set up the seats as the British Houses of Parliament, 2 lines opposing them. And I was going, no, we need to make a big circle out of this. So we made a big circle, and there had to be a gap so you could get in. And there was a roving mic, and it started to work. People were being quite critical of the curator and vice versa. And then they just got to one architect, and he stood up and he stood at the open space and started talking. And since he did that, then everybody just stood there, and it became not a conversation; it became a presentation of ideas. And you're right, like how you set up the space and how you control that allows different things to either emerge or not. Speaking of which, I'm anxious that I let other people ask you questions if they do, so I'm just going to shut up. Would anyone like to ask Kate a question before we close? I might have killed the urge to ask questions, Kate. I thought.
I love the way you said that last time. It was questions the whole way through. Sorry, it wasn't. Yeah. Yeah. Hopefully we'll do a podcast and get more coherent.
We'll do. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm going to stop the recording.
Well, thank you to everyone who stayed for an hour and a half. That's a mighty old. I think that's quite impressive.
Yeah, and then
the recording